And now, a passage from Americans in Eastern Asia by Tyler Dennett from Chapter 24, The United States and Korea Treaty of 1882. The preceding chapter on Japanese expansion closed, not because a convenient date had been reached, but because it is now necessary to describe another line of activity before going on with the account of Japan's efforts to consolidate a satisfactory territorial position in Asia. In taking the next step in Korea, Japan was greatly aided by the desire of Western nations, particularly the United States, to see the peninsula opened to trade. The movement to open Korea, first seriously initiated by William H. Seward in 1868 and accomplished in 1882 by Commodore R.W. Shufelt, was by far the most important political action undertaken by the United States in Asia until the occupation of the Philippines in 1898. To disturb Korea in any way was to disturb the equilibrium of the Far East. By the Treaty of 1876, in which Korea was led to disavow Chinese suzerainty, a balance had been established between China and Japan. The transcending political question for the Western nations was whether to recognize the contention thus set up by Japan that Korea was independent, or to continue to accept the evasive utterances of China as implying the existence of Chinese suzerainty. Expediency of disturbing the status quo. One is forced to the conclusion from a study of the declarations of both Chinese statesmen and Korean leaders of the time that there was involved for the Western nations no question of political righteousness. Notwithstanding the unconvincing nature of the disavowals of Chinese sovereignty, China in 1876 had no valid claim to Korea. Peking exercised no administrative functions and had repeatedly denied any control of Korean affairs. The Chinese had disavowed any responsibility for claims arising out of the damage to foreign life and property in the peninsula. They undertook no measures whatever to prevent shipwrecks or the recurrence of such events as the murder of the French missionaries. Even when one gives to the Chinese assertions of the subordinations of Korea to the empire a value unmodified by the accompanying disavowals of responsibility, one is forced to the conclusion that the Chinese were pursuing merely a dog-in-the-manger policy. They did not want Korea, but they did not want Korea to come under the shadow of any other power, nor did they relish the idea of Korean independence. Likewise, Japan had not the shadow of a claim to possession of Korea. Japan's claims were purely economic. In a measure, Japan was dependent upon Korea for foodstuffs. To admit that the economic dependence of one nation upon another constitutes a valid claim for territorial possession by the dependent country is to admit a proposition which renders insecure the boundaries of most of the nations of the earth. On the other hand, there was, in the existing relationship between Japan and Korea, a question of political expediency for the Western nations, which merited a greater degree of study than was given to it by American statesmen in their various efforts to enter into treaty relationship with the Korean people. For Korea, there were four possibilities: Chinese suzerainty, Japanese suzerainty, the suzerainty of some European power such as France or Russia, or political independence. In framing a policy to meet such an uncertain situation, the Americans could bring forward two traditional and characteristically American policies. The United States had already registered its disapproval of the advance of European powers in Asia, and was committed to a policy of recognizing and even sustaining in a feeble way the independence of the Asiatic states. And Americans were prone to hold that every people, with the exception of the American Indians, were, and by right, ought to be free and independent. Among the four possibilities enumerated above, the question of the future status of Korea was purely one of expediency. The Koreans, at least their rulers, were bitterly anti-foreign. They were disposed to adhere to a blind and irrational policy of seclusion. That they did not desire to be subjected to any Western power was obvious. That they would not welcome Japanese domination was equally evident. Where they stood, as between Chinese suzerainty and political independence, was not clear when the Americans came to consider the question of a treaty. Obviously, the United States was under no obligations to consider them independent if they did not so desire. But at this point, another question intervened. Which was better for American trade, Chinese suzerainty or Korean independence? Korea, under the shadow of China, presumably would resist rather than encourage foreign trade and domestic renovation. This consideration appears to have had influence. That a condition of technical independence, undefended and defenseless, might be worse than Chinese suzerainty seems never to have occurred to the American government. There were three possible ways to approach Korea: directly, through Japan, or through China. The United States tried them all impartially, moved by a single desire to make a treaty and to open the country. Direct negotiations were, as we have already noted, authorized by William H. Seward in 1868. Had the Japanese succeeded in 1868 or 1869 in establishing friendly relations with the Koreans, it is very probable that the government of the United States would have accepted the Japanese invitation, as the German representative at Tokyo did, and would have sought an entrance into Korea by means of Japanese good offices. The failure of the Japanese negotiations, however, induced the American government to make its next effort through Peking. The correspondence between U.S. Minister Low and the Sungli Yamen at Peking in 1870 to 1871 has already been alluded to. The details of the visit of the Americans to Korea in 1871 were as follows. The expedition, under the joint direction of Mr. Low and Admiral John Rogers, was designed to be carried out after the pattern of the Perry visit to Japan in 1853. It was as much of a failure as most imitations are. With a fleet of 5 steamships, the Americans arrived off the coast on May 19, 1871, and a few days later came to anchor in the Sallee River below Seoul. Communications with the shore were opened through some minor officials who visited the ship, but the objects of the expedition were not revealed. Shortly afterwards, a Korean fort fired on a surveying party which had proceeded up the river. And in the engagement which took place, 2 Americans were wounded and many Koreans were killed or wounded. Mr. Low demanded an apology, which was not forthcoming. The Americans then resorted to retaliation, destroying 5 forts and killing or wounding 350 Koreans. Again, Low demanded communications with high officials with a view to making a treaty, but now the Koreans were stubborn and refused to forward Low's letters to the king. The Americans were thus presented with a choice between further military measures or retirement. Not being prepared or authorized to undertake the conquest of Korea, Rear Admiral Rogers, like his predecessor, the French Admiral Rose, in 1866, decided to retire, which he did on July 3rd. Korea was again left in the belief that the foreigners had been compelled to retreat before her army, and the expedition was looked upon by the Chinese also as a defeat for foreigners. The outcome of the expedition was regretted by the foreign communities because it tended to lower the prestige of the foreign powers in Asia at a time when the Chinese were stiffening their opposition to the revision of the treaties. The expedition reflected no credit on the Americans. The United States inclines to Japan. The developments of the next few years materially altered the situations of both China and Japan with reference to the peninsula. Mr. Low became persuaded that the Chinese government had been acting with duplicity, and that while professing indifference, it had secretly exerted its influence to thwart the expedition. Meanwhile, other factors were at work to mar the relations between the Chinese and the foreigners. While the Americans had regarded the murder of the French Catholic converts in the Tientsin massacre in 1870 as due more to the rashness and unscrupulous conduct of the French than to the savagery of the Chinese, the murder of the British envoy Marjorie on the Burma border in 1875 had been a shock to the entire foreign body in China, and a sinister reminder of the fact that China tolerated the foreigners only because their armies and navies protected them. The persecution of Christians and missionaries was increasing. Furthermore, the Chinese immigration question in California was becoming acute. As an indication of the attitude of American public opinion, we may cite the fact that although Congress had extended permission to the Japanese students to enter the Naval Academy at Annapolis, the repeated requests of the Chinese government for a similar courtesy had been ignored. Japan, on the other hand, was steadily rising in the estimation of Americans. The first steps in the expansive movement noted in the preceding chapter had provoked admiration, although those who knew the details of the Japanese negotiations in Peking regarded them as treacherous. Meanwhile, the Japanese efforts at domestic reform had won the approval of the American government to such an extent that in 1878 Secretary of State William H. Evarts was willing to sign a revision of the Treaty of 1866. While DeLong had been recalled from Tokyo for his indiscretions, his contention had come to be accepted by the American government. Vis-a-vis, the Japan held the key by which to unlock the East. Soyashima in Peking in 1873 had forced the Chinese to abandon a most cherished tradition and secured for the diplomatic corps an audience with the emperor in which no kowtow had been exacted. 3 years later, Japan had succeeded in negotiating a treaty with Korea in which several ports were thrown open to Japanese trade. Although the European powers and the foreign diplomats in China were most reluctant to realize and admit it, Japan was, in the opinion of America, rapidly achieving the leadership of Eastern Asia. The Japanese were exerting themselves to gain this very recognition. Japanese policy was being directed towards inducing the foreign powers to deal with Korea through Japan. An article supplementary to the Treaty of August 24, 1876, had stipulated that in case any foreigners were wrecked on the coast of Korea, they were to be delivered to the Japanese authorities, who would assume responsibility for the repatriation. This article was obviously intended to transfer to Japan a relationship which had formerly existed between Korea and China. In 1866, the crew of the Surprise had been repatriated across the Chinese border and by the agency of Chinese officials. The next American effort to open Korea was made by Commodore R.W. Shufelt, who had commanded the USS Wachusett, which visited Korea in 1866-7 to investigate the General Sherman affair. Shufelt's instructions from R.W. Thompson, Secretary of the Navy, were dated October 29, 1878, and to them were added a letter from Secretary of State Evarts to Thompson, dated November 9, 1878, a little more than 3 months after the conclusion of the new treaty with Japan. Evarts expressed no great interest in the opening of Korea. So far as he knew, there had been no material change in the prospects since 1871. He drew attention to the provision of the Treaty of 1876 relating to the return of shipwrecked seamen by way of Japan as possibly indicating an intimacy between those two countries which may be taken advantage of, and stated that he would be glad to have Shufelt investigate and report as to whether Korea would be willing to make a treaty similar in spirit and purpose to those already in existence with other Oriental countries. Thompson directed Shufelt in the course of a cruise in the USS Ticonderoga, which was to include visits to unfrequented parts of Africa, Asia, and the islands of the Indian Ocean and adjacent seas, to visit some part of Korea with the endeavor to open by peaceful measures negotiations with that government. It is believed that the attack upon the Korean forts in 1871 is susceptible of satisfactory explanation, and that a moderate and conciliatory course towards the government would result in opening the ports of that country to American commerce. That the American government was aware, in thus resuming the efforts to open Korea, that it was taking any step of importance is not apparent. In April 1880, Commodore Shufelt in the Ticonderoga reached Nagasaki. His appearance and mission took the Japanese by surprise. United States Minister John A. Bingham had been instructed to invite the Japanese government to give Shufelt suitable letters of introduction to the Korean authorities. The Japanese hesitated. Foreign Minister Inoue stated that the Japanese government was reluctant to disturb the Koreans at a time when its own relations with them were still so largely unsettled. The best that Bingham was able to secure was a letter of introduction to the Japanese consul at Fusan. Shufelt arrived at Fusan May 4, 1880, and immediately attempted to send a letter to the King of Korea through the Japanese consul. The consul reported that the governor of the district refused to forward the letter. Shufelt then returned to Japan and went personally to Tokyo. With no little reluctance, Inoue was persuaded to send Shufelt's letter with one of his own to the King of Korea on the condition that Shufelt would remain at Nagasaki for an answer. Thus, the Americans were made to appear as though they were dealing with Korea through Japanese channels. This second attempt failed as dismally as the first, and in the reply of the Korean Minister of Ceremony, there appeared the following sentence, which was so lacking in truth as to raise suspicions as to its origin. It is well known to the world that our foreign relations are only with Japan, neighboring to us, which have been maintained since 300 years, and that other foreign nations are not only situated far from us, but there has never been any intercourse with them. It was reasonably clear to Schufelt that Japan was actuated by no earnest desire to have the trade of Korea thrown open to the world, and that the Japanese were manipulating the negotiations to serve their own purpose.